and bilingual writing.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you for the organizers, and I'm so honored to be here and to be able to experience the wonderful hospitality of Indonesia, a very wonderful experience. So I'm going to speak to you today about an article that I had published in the Tussle Journal, The Myth of the Critical Period Hypothesis. And I want to start off by saying, Assalamualaikum, selamat siang. I'm starting. We'll see how far I get. So, in terms of overview, we're going to have some definitions about what the critical period hypothesis is, and this is a very large audience, so I'm going to try to change it a little bit, but get some idea of what your background is, and then some examples of how this hypothesis has been accepted by the general public, and then we'll talk about what evidence exists and doesn't exist for it, what's against it, and then how this ties in to the classroom. So I want to ask, and it's hard to ask the audience because you're so big, but if somebody has an answer for us and wants to say something, I'll bring the mic over or something, we'll work it out. Is there a best time to learn a language? What have you heard about this? What do we know?
Every time. Time is before the age of puberty according to Lindenberg. Before critical period.
Is that what everybody in the room thinks, what she said is true?
No.
What do you think? Anybody else? What? Yes?
When someone feels they need to learn the language.
When they feel they need to learn the language. Okay, that may be true. So we have what is actually the theory, right? You gave the actual theory. And then we have another perspective that when it is valuable to learn, basically, right? When you need it. So, do you think it's harder for adults to learn another language?
Not really.
Why? Yes, I hear a lot of yes. Yes? Are children like magic sponges that just learn language?
No.
It's just like magic. Give them language and they'll learn it. Is that how it works?
Oh, no.
Or do children have to work too? Does it take children time to learn language? Do they just get it like that? Is there a difference between adults and children learning languages? What's that? There are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. How long does it take for a child to master a language? How long does it take for an adult to learn a language? The same. It takes 5 to 7 years in both cases. So, the critical period hypothesis for language learning, as our esteemed professor said, is a theory that was developed. It's based upon a long observation that sometimes adults, have you noticed, sometimes they have like an accent, right? Or they repeatedly make grammatical errors that you don't see in some speakers who learn languages younger. And so this is drawing on other people, but he's basically said that there was a loss of neuroplasticity, and he said it was around the age of puberty. So Eric Lindenberg published a book. It had an afterword by Noam Chomsky. It was a really influential book. But the reality is that as years have gone by, people have looked at this theory, and a critical review was published in 2011 in an academic journal, and their basic conclusion is there is some relationship, but the precise nature of that relationship remains very controversial, and it is not hard and settled. But people tend to think it's true. So the first thing is, what is a critical period? if we talk about it from a scientific, biological perspective, it's like a window that closes after a certain time, an age. You cannot ever acquire whatever we're talking about. So ocular representation in kittens, if they have an eye sealed when they're very young, they'll never see out of that eye, ever. No possibility for them to ever see out of that eye. The same thing with using both eyes together, binocularity, that it has to be both working at the same time or they'll never quite get it. Very funny example, if you take some ducks a certain time after they're hatched and you give them the wrong mother, that'll be their mother, no matter what. It could be a cat, it could be whatever. It's a biologically determined thing. Then they have a different type of biological phenomena that's called a sensitive period, which simply is that if your abilities are inhibited during that time frame, you'll not be as good at it, but you'll be able to kind of overcome it and get good enough at it. And an example of that is barn owls, who have to combine to get spatial maps in the dark, information that they get from both their ears and their eyes, and combine them together, everything. And if they have some problem in one of those things, they might have some problems putting them all together, but they'll be able to overcome it. Now, does language learning as an adult, does it sound more like that closed window, or more like something that you can overcome, that you can learn it, but maybe have to work at it? It sounds more like the second, right? So his use of the name critical period was problematic at the beginning. So this is where I wasn't sure. Big audience, is there a set age where people start to learn another language in Indonesia? Is it like determined in the curriculum or something like that? Is it like, this is the age when we start? Or is it different for different people? When did we start to learn English in here, among you? Different? Okay. What is the variation?
Based on their special social status, if they're quite rich, they will give the language for English study in the early childhood. But if they are not rich enough, they will study English in the junior school as the responsibility to study in the junior school for English.
In high school?
Junior high school.
Younger.
Younger. Yeah, so it depends on the social status.
Okay, great, thank you. So there can be some variation within Indonesia, the precise age that people started at. So, how many people feel like they've mastered a language that they started to learn after puberty? Just raise your hand. Raise your hand if you've mastered a language that you've learned after puberty. How many people in this room? That's it? I counted like 6 people maybe. Only 6 people have learned a language that they're good at post-puberty. I mean, come on, we're in a room full of English speakers. And you all started when? Before puberty or after?
After.
And you're relatively good at it, right?
Yeah.
So why doesn't everybody raise their hand? Listen, I've learned 4 languages to communicative ability post-puberty, where I rate myself, 1 being good, 6 being poor, and I can communicate in all of those languages. In fact, I was speaking with Anne's husband a little bit in German, just a smidgen. That's my weakest language. So it can be done. I was always a little hesitant about the critical period hypothesis just because of my own experience. So I would say the critical period hypothesis, based on my own experience, and I think based on your experience too, it's just not a realistic to view language as being like a closed window that you can't learn it. At any age, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but you can do it when you need it, as you said, right? So, but I see constantly that people think that this is the truth. I've seen it in TESOL conferences. I'm sitting there in a conference and people are saying, oh, children are just magic learning sponges and you have to learn language before puberty, and they just repeat it over and over again. Even at academic conferences, I keep getting it from students. Students, when they see this theory anywhere, they're like, yeah, that's true. You know, and I find it in textbooks. I looked through textbooks, linguistics textbooks, and found that most of them had an acceptance of this theory. This is an example of one textbook. All the text in green is saying positive things in favor of the critical period hypothesis. That one sentence in red is their only caveat, their only thing where they're saying there might be some other factors. So it's very common and widespread in most of the textbooks which are used in teaching linguistics and applied linguistics. But in reality, the evidence for the critical period hypothesis is very mixed. And this is both evidence from people's experiences learning additional languages at a later age, and then also experience from learning native languages. So, like 15 years later, whether she at learning a language, who's better in the classroom? Children or adults? Who learns quicker at the beginning? No. Okay, I'm hearing both. I'm hearing people say both. But the evidence is consistent. Adults are better learners at the start. But children will eventually outperform the adults because they have more time to keep learning, right?
Yes.
So adults are like kind of like they spring out like that, you know, hair, and the children come in like the turtle, slow but sure, and they overcome. So there is some evidence that the way adults think and the way that adults try to learn languages is counterproductive. So this is, they made up an artificial language which was to mock kind of like the grammar of a language. And they had 4 different groups. One of them was told to color while they listened to the language and just kind of listen to it and just color, not pay attention that much. There was another group that was told to try to figure out the words that were found in the stream that they were hearing. The other ones, they asked them to look at the kinds of words that there were. In the final group, they asked them to look at the categories of how the words were put together, the order. So they were trying to get this last group to pay most attention to what would be the grammar in what they were giving, the input that they're giving them. And you know what they found? An interesting finding, that the group that actually did the best at figuring out what the grammar of the mini system that they had, the group that did the best was the group that was told to sit back and color and not pay attention to it that much. So there's something, when we look at and study grammar and try to pay attention to it, we're kind of like, and it's such a complex system, that we're almost shooting ourselves in the foot as adults. By trying to do that very analytic style of such a complex system, it really doesn't help us. It's better to use it, which is what I'm hearing over and over in this conference, that we need lots of input, lots of rich input, and endlessly and drills and stuff like that. It's just not going to work. So for sound, there's pretty consistent evidence that if somebody starts to learn at an older age, they're going to have a stronger accent. But that's not 100%. It's also been demonstrated that older learners can learn new sounds, and that with practice, that they can improve their pronunciation and hear the differences between the sounds. So it's not like completely shut off. It is possible for them to learn the sound organization of the new languages. There's also been claims that older learners are bad at learning like the structure, syntax of language. So Johnson and Newport were researchers who looked at native speakers of Korean and Chinese at the University of Illinois, and they gave them 276 sentences to do grammatical judgments on. And these are some ungrammatical sentences that they had in the data, and they wanted them to say, no, that's bad English. The little boy is speak to the policeman. I hope everybody agrees with me, it should be speaking, right? Speaking. So they found that they claimed there was an age effect, that up until puberty, and then after that, the data spread out. Here it's linear before puberty, and then it spreads out. There's lots of differences. So they claim that there was an age effect, and it's something that's been very heavily debated in the literature. So, follow-up study, a direct, where they did this, replicated the study, and they had similar findings, but actually quite different in some ways. Their finding was that English use strongly correlated to accuracy. So if you use the language a lot, you're actually much more accurate. And that the Spanish speakers in this study outperformed the Korean and Japanese the Korean and Chinese speakers from the previous study. And that the onset of age effects was significantly later, and that there was evidence of native-like performance for older learners in this study, which completely contradicts. If there's native-like performance, then you can actually learn it as an older learner. So this has been a recent study that had similar kinds of findings. They did this one with an online quiz where they had it go completely viral, and they ended up with over 669,000 participants. So they had it as like a quiz that would guess where you were from, but they had embedded in it with enough grammar questions where they could do the same kind of test of their grammar competence. And they had all kinds of language groups, and it was just a really, really big study. And the power of this study gave it so much force in a way that it really is kind of a compelling study in many ways. But their basic results are, they did find that native speakers, their learning got at its highest level at approximately 30 years, and that for learning it as an additional language, there was decline after 17.4 years, that it wasn't as strong after that. So they claim that you have to really start learning by at least 10 to 12 years of age to avoid running out of time with that 17.4 period. But also, most importantly, I think, their data included many examples of older learners who reached native-like competence, which basically, if somebody reaches native-like competence at an older age, it basically means that the claims of the critical period hypothesis, that it's like a window that's closed, are completely inaccurate. And there's been plenty of evidence of speakers who started learning at an older age who have reached a level indistinguishable from native speakers. This is Julie, who moved at 21 to Cairo and started learning Egyptian Arabic and was indistinguishable within like 3 or 4 years of when she moved there. She could speak Arabic to such a high level. She was tested, this is a little bit after when she first moved there, but people noticed that she really caught on quickly from the beginning. This was done like 15 years later, but she really did reach a high level in Egyptian Arabic. So now we're going to turn to evidence from native language acquisition. So the cases where children have been neglected, where they've been kind of abandoned and not taught language, abused in fact. The two most famous ones are Victor, who crawled out of a forest in southern France at the beginning of the 18th century, was taken to Paris under the care of a doctor, and he tried to teach him French. And ultimately, after 5 years, he wrote a book about his experience, saying that Victor kind of plateaued, didn't get further. And the same thing happened when Jeannie was discovered in Los Angeles, where she'd been tied to a chair in a bedroom in a ranch house in Los Angeles and abused if she made noise. They basically didn't talk to her. She was an extreme victim of abuse, but she was taken by a team of people who tried to teach her language. And after about 5 years again, she got some aspects of language. She was good at meaning, but she wasn't very good at acquiring syntax. But the problem with making too much out of these cases is the confound of abuse. These individuals were profoundly abused, and they lacked key development, cognitive development in many areas, not just language. And because of the confound of abuse, which leads to extreme problems, which has been further discovered, studies on orphans who were abused and stuff like that, that abuse is such an extreme situation that you really can't make much out of these particular cases. Better evidence exists from deaf individuals, because they commonly are brought up in families where other people are hearing and they're not getting the exposure to full sign language because the other people in their family may not, when they go away to a school for the deaf or something like that. In individuals with this kind of story, they do show some correlation with the ability to sign with the age that they start to acquire sign, but it's not as strong. It's not like completely like they don't have the ability to sign. It's just kind of a slight decline. Finally, cochlear implants is pretty strong evidence, but it's pretty strong evidence kind of different in a sense. So cochlear implants, it's been found that the sooner that you do it, the better results that you're going to have. And if you don't have the cochlear implants within like the first 2 years of life, that it will be more difficult to acquire oral language. The cochlear implants do need to be young, but then this directly ties in to what is really the only evidence that is entirely clear related to the critical period hypothesis and with native language acquisition. It's that when we're in our first 2 years of life, we learn the sound categories of our native language. So this study was done in the 1980s, and it's been replicated over and over again. So young children, within 9 months, they've already started to learn the sound categories of their native language. And once you've learned them, you become less sensitive to sounds that aren't found in your native language. And it becomes more difficult to start to hear differences that you haven't previously been exposed to. But you can't do it. You can't overcome it. It's not completely closed. It's just a sensitive that you've kind of developed this ability that you hear the sounds in your own native language, but are not used to the ones in the other languages. So this is showing the declining ability of English learners to hear the sounds from when they're 6 to 8 months to when they're 8 to 10 months and when they're 10 to 12 months in Hindi and Salish, which is the Native American language. So this kind of finding is consistent over and over again. That first year of life, we learn the sounds in our native language, and we don't hear sounds that we aren't used to. They're more difficult to acquire, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be acquired. It just is more difficult. So overall, the critical period hypothesis is not a proved hypothesis. At most, there is evidence, strong evidence, for there being a sensitive period within the first year of life, and it's really not a critical period. It's not like a closed window. It's more like something that you can overcome, but it's more difficult to learn. And in fact, for language learning in general, the success of adults as opposed to children, there's not just factors of age. When we talk about adults, it's not just age that's a difference between children and adults. There are so many other factors that are involved. I wish we could just generate a list of all the different factors, but a few of them that come to my mind include, once you are an adult, you have a more formed identity, you have your cultural identity, it's a part of who you are, and for you to learn another language to the ability where you learn it so that you sound almost native-like, you almost have to give up a piece of yourself. Adults, another factor, they don't have the time to master a language like children do. What do children have to do during the first 5 years of their life? Learn language, right? That's their job. That's the only thing they need to do. Adults, is that ever going to be true for them? That somebody's going to do all their cooking and cleaning for them while they go off and play and learn language? No. Nobody's going to do that for adults. It's been shown that adults who really want to learn another language, who are really dedicated, really motivated, really identify with that culture, they're more successful learners. Those who are immersed more, those who have more opportunities for authentic use of the language in real situations. So this is what we keep saying, that adults need all learners need lots of rich input. They need lots of situations that are genuine to use the language authentically. And that is how people learn language. We know how people learn language. The problem is how to structure it within a classroom and within a curriculum. So, you know, the belief that the critical period hypothesis, it affects people. What do adults say about learning another language if they've been told over and over that you can't learn a language after puberty? What do adults say then? Well, I can't do it, right? And they take one class and they get frustrated and they say, I can't learn language. I can't do this. It makes an excuse for adults not to even try to learn languages, or if they do try and get frustrated, because it's a hard thing to do. It's an excuse that lets them say, oh, well, it was hard, I couldn't do it, but it's because it was the biologically critically determined period or whatever. You know, we've also seen cases where because people believe children are magic language learners, that they can just shut off their first language and make them completely learn in a new language if they're before puberty, and it won't have any harm on the children. In fact, it's been very harmful. There's still, in the United States, we had 3 states which passed laws that banned any kind of bilingual education for children. But one still persists in that law. It's the state of Arizona. But you can actually see the language of the critical period hypothesis in the proposal that started this move to ban bilingual education in the United States. It can happen in other places. They put people in school and they don't work with their native language. They just teach them in the curriculum, in the language of the school, instead of working with the language that the child is bringing from home. I know that in Indonesia, there's many languages, right? And in Indonesia, if somebody comes from a particular dialect or another form of language, and they need to learn the official Indonesian dialect, does the education system do something to address their native language that they have from their home? Do they do something to try to build on that language, to bridge them into the official dialect? I don't know. Not really? It's something to think about. Because I think it's something that people will get lost if you don't give them that kind of a bridge and build upon their own knowledge. It's the same thing when they were talking about Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development. part of that is the language that they have that they're bringing to school. You have to build upon what language they have and see it as a resource. Sometimes when people speak a dialect that is not an official kind of dialect, people will look down upon it and say it's deficient, that there's something wrong with it because it's not the correct way to speak. That's not true. There is no such thing as a correct and an incorrect way to speak. If a group of people speaks that way and uses it to understand one another within their community, there's just different ways of speaking, and the correctness of any dialect or way of speaking has to do with the power or the social power of the group that speaks that way. So we always need to remember that about our students and build upon whatever language they bring to school and see it for the rich resource that it is. So, how important is the critical age hypothesis in the classroom? Well, I'd like to say it isn't important, since it's not proved, and the evidence indicates that there's really only a sensitive period, most relevant for sounds. But, you know, we need to educate people that they can learn languages. And we also need to structure our language curriculum in ways that can help people to reach fluency in other languages. In some of the work that I've been doing, have been taking the language learning histories of people and examining them for patterns in their stories. And one of the students that I had the pleasure of teaching over the years was brought up in Holland, in Europe, who are known for their language abilities. And the way that she talked about the structuring of the curriculum, the language curriculum in Holland, and how she was, from a very young age, from the very beginning of her school, when she came to school at the youngest, was being exposed to English, and then gradually having it be made harder with demands that she communicate and use the language. It was eye-opening to me. And this is what we need to do, is to learn from that people who know how to teach languages and develop a curriculum that starts young and builds slowly with fully knowing what people are available on and drawing upon what we know about language teaching that really works. So, you know, students, you know, who come to school are fully capable of learning languages at any age, but different learners will have different needs. If they're younger, the curriculum is going to need to be different than from when they're older. They have different learning styles. Their brains work in different ways. We need to be aware of the science of how the brain works at different ages. You know, younger learners, you need to build on the language that they have, constantly developing in that zone of proximal development, increasing the zone, making it, constantly expanding their language ability. And, you know, learning only in their new language isn't a good idea for a while, because research consistently shows 5 to 7 years to master a new language to ability where you can get all of the academic language. So it takes time for people to be ready to be able to use a new language. It takes time, whether you're young or old. So older learners, we need to let them know that the critical period hypothesis is not an excuse not to learn another language. I'll say that in another way. The critical period hypothesis, they can't use it as an excuse to say they can't learn another language or English or whatever. So they need to be told that there isn't hard evidence for this theory, that it's simply a theory, that they can learn another language. We need to be honest with them that it is a lot of work and that they need to use it and really integrate it into their lives. You know, even if you've learned a language, if you stop using it, you can then lose it. All language learning involves use. If you don't use it, you lose it. So teachers need to be aware of how to best structure the curriculum, how to best get them to move into the levels and to increase their language ability. So, terima kasih banyak. Boleh saya bertanya? Boleh.
Okay, thank you very much for Professor John Evar Strid. You have a blessing.